If you look at my web page, I have a container with a green background and the corners are rounded. This is accomplished using the border radius property. In order to see those rounded corners, I either need a background color in my container or a border in order to show the edges. If you contrast this with a typical border, you will see the straight edges as opposed to the rounded corners. There are several different values that we can apply to the border radius property in order to create some very nice effects. So if I were to apply one value to the border radius property, that would set all of my four corners to the same value as I have here. We can also set the individual sides, and the syntax for the individual sides are border top left radius, border top right radius, border bottom right radius, border bottom left radius. It's a little bit more complicated than just top right, bottom left, because both corners are on the top, one is on the right, one is on the left. Both corners are on the bottom, one is on the right, one is on the left. When we are setting the border radius property, we are actually setting two values. The value of the curve on the x-axis and the value of the curve on the y-axis. If we were to just set one value, that would apply equally to the x curve and the y curve. However, you could set the individual values. And in this case, 50-50 would be the same as just using 50 once. However, we can skew the sides. So in this example, we have a curve going 100 pixels on the x and 50 pixels on the y. In the next example, we have reversed that curve, so we have 50 pixels on the x and 100 pixels on the y. You can set the four different values differently. So here we have an example where we have the first value is set to the top left, the second value is set to the top right, the third value is set to the bottom right, and the third value is set to the bottom left. This does go in clockwise order, but the syntax is a little different. If you just use three values for the border radius property, how those values are being applied. The first value is applied to the top left, the second value is applied to the top right and the bottom left, so you're going diagonally across. The third is set to the bottom right. If you were to just use two values, the first value is set to the top left and the bottom right, so we're going diagonally in one direction. The second value is set to the top right and bottom left, so we're going diagonally in a different direction. If you were to set the x and y radius differently, you would see a slash being used, and this would apply equally to all four sides. If you were to set the border radius to 50%, you would get a circle. Let's see how we might use border radius. Supposing I just wanted to round out the bottom of my box. I can set two values, one for the border bottom left radius, one for the border bottom right radius. And notice we have a very nice effect. You don't necessarily have to place curves on all four sides. Sometimes curves on two sides look very nice. The box shadow property allows us to create a drop shadow effect around a container. This also applies to an image, as does the border radius property apply to an image. The box shadow property takes 5 values. Only 2 of those values are required. The first value is the horizontal shadow, essentially the horizontal offset. So in this example, the shadow is 5 pixels away from the edge on the right. The second value is the vertical shadow. So in this example, the shadow is 5 pixels away from the bottom. Those 2 are required. The other 3 values are optional. The blur distance enables you to create a soft edge. And in this case, we have a 5 pixel blur. The spread distance enables you to move that away from the box, and in this case we have a 5-pixel spread. The color value would be the value of the shadow, and remember, when you impose a blur on it, it will dilute that color a little. If you do not specify a color value, it will default to black. These values are very similar to a drop shadow in Photoshop if you are familiar with Photoshop. Supposing I wanted to reverse the direction of the shadow. Rather than on the right bottom, which is the default, I want it on the top left. I can do that by using negative values. I can also do that by using the inset keyword. However, the inset keyword creates a little bit of a different effect in that it changes the perspective so that the container does have that inset appearance. Similar to applying multiple backgrounds, you can also apply multiple shadows. And like applying multiple backgrounds, the values are comma separated depending on how many shadows you would need. So here we see a red shadow, and notice that that is on the closest, the outside. The blue shadow is behind the red shadow. So in order to have the second shadow being visible, the horizontal and vertical offset needs to be more than that in the first shadow, or else you would not see the shadow. So let's take a look at the box shadow property. If I were to set just the horizontal and the vertical shadow and a color, here you see the shadow. Notice that it is more of a solid shadow than the shadow below. The shadow below has a blur and a spread distance. If we were to add the blur, notice we have a softer edge. However, it is not extending as far as the shadow underneath because we do not have a spread distance. And actually, I prefer the shadow without a spread distance. The box shadow and the border radius sometimes work very nicely together. And here we see our rounded corners with a very nice drop shadow. Again, these properties will enhance an image very nicely.